I am Jeni Chappelle, a freelance book editor and an editor in residence for WriteHive. And it's my pleasure to introduce an editor I admire, Diana Pho. Diana M. Pho is a queer Vietnamese American independent scholar, playwright, and Hugo Award nominated fiction editor. She has over a decade of experience in traditional Big Five publishing, including Tor Books, Tor.com Publishing, and the Science Fiction Book Club. Diana currently works as story producer at SerialBox, developing unique and cutting-edge science fiction and fantasy stories. Additionally, she has a double bachelor's degree in English and Russian literature from Mount Holyoke College and a master's in performance studies from New York University. Diana's academic work includes critical analysis of the role of race in fashion, performance, and the media, in addition to pieces focusing on fan studies and fan communities. Welcome to WriteHive, Diana, and thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Jeni.
I'd like to get started by, could you just tell us a little bit about your experience in publishing and how the industry has changed some during the time you've been editing?
Oh, certainly. So I think you hit the nutshell of my career. And I guess to elaborate a little bit more about that, I have over a decade of experience working in publishing. I actually started off in international sales and marketing at a Big Five house, and then I moved over from there to the Science Fiction Book Club, and from there I was able to get into science fiction editorial. And I was at Tor for almost a decade, and now I'm at SerialBox, which is, I'm sure we'll talk more about it later, but it is an audio fiction company that produces all of its episodes, as weekly installments or like as, individual installments that
little
our
serials.
audiences can follow. Yeah, exactly.
Yep.
So sometimes people don't get like the pun in cereal box.
Yeah,
They're
I
like,
love-
is that a breakfast cereal? I'm like,
right.
no.
So fun.
So yeah, so it's and it's just been really interesting thinking about the progression of my career, partly because I think it also tracks with how publishing is now facing a lot of different questions that it has been wrestling with for decades. And I think, last year with the pandemic and all of the economic shifts that happened, it also affected how, readers read books, how people, and found entertainment in different venues, and how publishing itself was, struggling in facing all of these larger institutional problems that they, have ignored for the large part
Sure.
until that moment. So one of the things, I think about a lot in terms of people who are working in the industry is one, there's, for a long time, there are a lot of conversations about fair compensation for publishing professionals. The fact that for a very long time, historically, the only way you can get into the industry was to first get an internship, which was usually unpaid. And then hopefully you were able to get your foot in the door at some company that way, and how that, was very unfair to people that didn't have access to have an unpaid internship,
Sure.
or access to go in New York City, which was, considered a publishing hub. So I think what happened last year was, one, a lot of people realized that a majority of publishing jobs can be done from home.
Right.
And you didn't have to necessarily be in New York to do it. There's also the whole conversation about fair compensation came to a head, especially when you had junior staff that was largely overworked and underpaid, having to, have increased burden on their workload, while also trying to live in the most expensive city in the country.
Sure.
While also trying not to get this, pandemic, this virus going around.
Right.
So like one of the positives actually I've seen in industry, if you're a professional, is that many of the big five companies raised their starting entry-level salaries, which people have been clamoring for, for decades to be like fairly compensated. It's still, there's still like a ways to go.
Sure.
It's still actually not a proper living wage for New York City.
No doubt.
but it was definitely better than it was before. There has also just been conversations about about representation, inclusion, which has been going on for much, much longer. And I think right now, we are at a point with the types of media industries that are out there where there's different types of, things that get people's attention. You have to compete with like the billion streaming channels out there. You have to compete with audiobooks and podcasts.
Sure.
You have to compete with like the, billion plus dollar video game industry. And so there's just so many more activities that take up people's time. And during the pandemic, statistically, they did show an increase in book sales for, part of last year because of the pandemic. Mostly those, sales were actually in academic and educational publishing as parents are trying to educate their children at home.
That makes sense.
And, and there was an increase, in nonfiction versus fiction titles because of that as well. And now it's very interesting, just like following the, the quarterly reports about what was those sales sustainable throughout the second half of 2020. It wasn't necessarily true. So what does that mean for the publishing industry coming into 2021 and, going forward that we're still in this pandemic? It's slightly easier to get to sell books,
right?
Obviously. There's I feel like I can go on forever and ever about this.
Sure.
So feel free to detour.
No, I'm totally nerding out with you. Let's go.
So I was gonna go deep into like stuff, but just checking. For example, there was a huge like concern and drop off in sales beginning of the pandemic, because a lot of online retailers that would usually sell books changed their shipping policy and be like, we're going to prioritize essential items, and we're not going to ship books. And so that delayed release dates between like March through like August.
Sure.
So a lot of books had to like be pushed out into like 2021 or even 2022. The books that decided that were kept in publisher schedules for 2020 did suffer a loss, especially if they were debuts, and that was really hard. So I feel terrible for any author who debuted last year.
Right.
There was a huge concern, about whether stores will like carry books in brick and mortar stores when they're also prioritizing essential items instead. And there was definitely like several cutbacks in mainstream chain retailers with their like book sections because of that. Barnes and Noble, which is like our only major bookstore chain, took a hit because not all their stores could be open. And even now, several Barnes and Noble's locations had to close completely. There was worries like throughout all the indie bookstores about whether they could remain open and sustainable as well.
Right.
And so essentially, like, there's this last year was a huge watershed moment, and I think we're going to see the continued fallout, but also all these new innovations because that huge shift happened.
Yeah. So speaking of innovations, like I'd love to hear more about your current job at SerialBox and kind of the cool new things that are going on there.
Yeah. So SerialBox, for those who aren't familiar, we are a company that like does different types of audio fiction storytelling and distribution. And what is really exciting about my job is that I'm a story producer. And so a lot of it, you know, is relevant to what I've done in the past. I still acquire books. I still acquire, you know, stories for the platform. It's also exciting for me because I also get to do what we call intellectual property development, so IP work. So, and for those who are not familiar with what that means, it basically means, you know, content that is created by the publisher or coming from a franchise or another licensor to create stories, you know, using their media characters.
Sure.
You know, so for example, right now I am working with SerialBox on, you know, this latest show about Batman. You know,
Nice.
that would be on the platform. We also we work with both Marvel and DC. Black Panther came out, you know, just you know, around beginning of this year. It was very successful. We also do titles such as Orphan Black. We also, you know, distribute for other like audio, you know, publishers and other publishers in general. For example, if you look on our website, we have, you know, the catalog of all of the Doctor Who audio dramas because we have a distribution deal with the BBC. So, you know, so there's like, so it kind of like opened my eyes to the different types of publishing that I've always like known existed, but didn't really interact with for my day-to-day job
Right.
before. And so having that level of imagination, creativity is pretty exciting. You know, SerialBox also developed its own IP. And so, and that's actually not unheard of. Writers out there may have heard of book packagers, for example, like Alloy was one. So, you know, where, you know, companies or publishers, you know, brainstorm the ideas, you know, in-house, and then they hire writers to write the book or the series based on like the ideas that the editors and the publishers have created. So that is in itself is pretty exciting because I've never done that level of editorial work before. I find it very like refreshing because I'm used to like working with authors and fostering their creativity and making sure their books are the strongest that they are possible, and having the ability to develop my own ideas in that way and then finding the right writer for the project feels like a different sort of thinking that is very refreshing and creative for me.
That's great. It's great when you can take your existing experience and use it in new ways that help you grow in your career and also helps authors too. So that's really neat. That's very cool. Yeah. So when you have an author with SerialBox, do they write serially too, or do they give you like all of the story at once and then it's broken up, or how does that work in terms of that process of writing and editing?
Yeah. So for us, like everything is planned and put together. You know, the whole manuscript is finished even before it goes into recording because that obviously it's like that's a smart thing. So it's not like if the author runs late, the whole thing runs late.
Right. Well, it always surprises me when I find out like television shows, especially like sitcoms, how close to the time that they air they actually record it. I'm like, it makes me anxious just thinking about it. So it makes a lot of sense that you would want to have everything ready up front.
Right. And, you know, and that reminds me too, that for SerialBox, we've had projects where we hire single authors to write the whole, you know, show. We've also had projects where we assemble a writer's room, very much the Hollywood film and television style, where, you know, there's a lead writer that basically acts like the showrunner, and they work together with a story producer to populate the writer's room, which is a team of writers that get together. They formulate the whole, you know, season arc. They like flesh out the world building and the character, you know, arcs that are supposed to happen. Episodes are assigned. That is also another way of thinking that I never got to participate in until I arrived here. And that is also just very fun seeing writers collaborate.
Yes. Yeah. I think there's a special kind of magic that happens when you get a room full of creatives all working toward a common goal.
So, it also like harkens back to my background in theater. And that in itself is pretty exciting to think about, like, oh, so I just like these writers' rooms, particularly because writers are less dramatic than actors. And I don't have to worry about like, something wrong with that happens during tech or anything like that,
Right. That makes a lot of sense. So what else are you seeing in terms of other things like SerialBox, like other ways that publishing is sort of branching out into new areas, and just kind of some exciting things that are happening in publishing right now?
I've seen a lot of publishers experiment in different ways. For example, just like the opening of various like new imprints. I've definitely paid attention to One World, which focused on marginalized voices when it came out. I know like Tor has a horror imprint, Nightfire, which I had helped from the back end set up when I was at Tor. They just launched their first season of books, which is pretty exciting. But also just seeing the different ways that that like IP and franchising work has been branching out. I've noticed for the last several years, both like comic book, publishing, but also just like large scale like media franchises have been employing experienced sci-fi and fantasy writers to write work for hire projects. And so like I've definitely seen like Chuck Wendig, Rebecca Roanhorse, Dana Jose Older, writers of high caliber in sci-fi and fantasy in general, but their profiles just like leaped, into like unknown heights because they wrote for Star Wars.
Right. And it's really exciting to see so many new diverse voices moving into these areas that have been, traditionally like all white men writing it. So like Star Wars and comic books. It's really exciting to see women working on these, to see people of color working on them, to see LGBTQ people working on them, and bringing all of that into these worlds. It's really cool it's cool from like a publishing nerd standpoint, but just as a consumer and a reader, I think it's really neat too.
Yeah, so like part of me like thinks that the rise and the interest in IP work is becoming is becoming more pertinent, especially if you are either like a writer looking for a new venue to participate in. If you are a writer from a different field, sometimes crossover happens much easier by starting an IP. And also one of the one of like the shifts in publishing that a lot of people are concerned about now is the disappearing mid-list.
Sure.
And so what I mean by that, it's like writers that will be traditionally published, at a large house because their books have a certain audience and they know that it's not going to be a New York Times bestseller, but their books always sell at a certain number of copies and there's a dedicated reader base and their, advances always earn out. Like, so they're worth investing in, to create like a solid core for a publisher's list because they have that certain level of dependability, even though they won't be like the huge breakout people. And there's been a lot of concern, but the fact that, because, big, large scale publishing has been consolidating more and more. When I started in publishing, it used to be the big six, and now it's going to be the big four.
Right.
So what does that mean when you have, all this consolidation happening? One of the fallouts people worry is that they're going to focus on chasing big books in order to meet their budget, requirements, and also the combined resources to shell out like huge advances to compete with each other,
Right.
but at the cost of not taking as many smaller authors because they
Sure.
won't be seen as worth it.
Right. So it's almost like we'll have more of those really big famous authors, but not as many books total.
Right. So there's that concern, or there's like a concern that it'll be harder to break in,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and and that's where I see publishing transforming in interesting ways. Like I don't, for example, like I don't think it's that doom and gloom for
Mm-hmm.
for writers. They just have to think about their career in different ways.
Mm-hmm.
And in addition to that, I think it'll help writers reconsider the importance of indie publishing, which has
Sure.
already like grown considerably since it first like bloomed in like the early 2000s.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to have like authors rethink regional and mid-list publishers, like
Sure.
publishers who aren't based in New York City but are equally adequate and have the same distribution lines, and may not be like Random House, but they know how to take care of their authors. They can pay a certain level of advance that is comparable that they would have probably gotten from New York.
Mm-hmm.
But also they would probably be getting more publicity and marketing attention because a smaller house doesn't have to worry about that same overhead. They can afford to spend more. They can afford to like take more risks on
Sure.
Publishers that would have been considered more niche or more mid-list by a larger house.
Right. Right. That's really interesting. For writers who are interested in finding out more about IP work, that might be something that they would want to do in their careers. Is that really only an option for authors who have already had other stories published with a traditional publisher, and then they would sort of transition into IP work? Or is there a way that someone who hasn't been published before can get started with IP work?
You'd still have to have some sort of publishing track record,
Mm-hmm.
whether it's in short fiction, whether you're a screenwriter, whether you're a comic book writer or a playwright. There has to be like some sort of background that's proof of concept that this is your strength in writing and you can finish something.
That makes sense.
So, but I've, definitely, at SerialBox, we've worked with all types of writers, like,
Sure.
that I've just named, because they have certain qualities in itself that's also conducive to great audio fiction.
Right.
So for writers interested in IP, there is definitely a lot of ways to go about it. Obviously, like SerialBox is not the only company that writes, IP-based projects. Right. There might be other venues an author might consider. For example, if they are interested in game writing,
Mm-hmm.
or narrative game writing, which are
Mm-hmm.
actually both separate different skills, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
That might be something they can consider. For example, I've definitely worked with writers that got their start in games.
Mm-hmm.
And and for that, that's like a whole other level of research.
Sure.
But there's definitely, I think, an increase of companies looking for game writers, for example.
Right.
If you are interested in, getting into any sort of IP work, like we at SerialBox are always looking for different types of talent. So if you do have a background, in any sort of creative writing, that's something that I could definitely consider. I'm always looking at like people's writing samples, for example, looking for writers to fill our rooms, especially when we know that we have upcoming projects in the works that we will have, like, we need a certain type of writer for.
Right.
For example, beginning of this year, we announced this deal that we have with John Carpenter called John Carpenter Presents.
Mm-hmm.
And so right now we're working with him and his people to formulate, really compelling horror ideas. So at the moment, I'm actually looking for people that have really strong horror writing backgrounds.
Right.
So
yeah, that's very cool. It's very exciting. I'm always interested in different ways, different paths to publication, It seems like we writers get this idea of like the only way to become a published author is sort of that traditional way. of, you query, you get the agent, you go to the big five, and of course the dream is you're one of those top, level best-selling agent or authors right off the bat. But there's just so many different options now, and it's really cool to see things like SerialBox coming out and kind of expanding that aspect of the market even more. That's really neat. A lot of people online might know you from the edits for Black SFF project, science fiction fantasy. I saw that program going around last year. I know you were involved with that, so I'd love to hear some about how that came about. If it's something you think will happen again.
Yeah, certainly. So edits for Black Sci-Fi, was, an event that I hosted last summer, which is basically, a small but meaningful way for, Black sci-fi fantasy writers to get the feedback that they need to help boost their profile. Whether it's query review, a look at like one's, the first 10 pages of your manuscript, or like do a whole developmental edit. And that came about partly because I was between jobs at the time. And I was doing freelance editorial work. And I had someone, like two authors came up to me, and they both said like, hey, like, we don't need editorial work done, but could we like help support a Black author get editorial work done if we, pay in a, pay it forward with your services? And I'm like, sure, why not? And so we just like constructed, edits for Black sci-fi in order to create, just like an effective way to like tell people like, hey, I'm doing this, without it feeling like a first come, first serve opportunity.
Sure.
It was, I think it was very successful. We actually raised enough money, with a bunch of writers actually contributed towards this. And with the money raised, it was enough to cover for, a set of like query plus 10-page edits, one full developmental edit, and to pay for 3 other people of color to serve as slush readers.
Nice.
Sorry, 4. Sorry. But like, yeah. So like that was like, so that in itself was, I'm hugely appreciative towards like the science fiction, fantasy, and the young adult community for pitching in to do something like that. At the end we had selected, 8 winners and 1 winning manuscript for the developmental edit. So far, one of the finalists moved on to become agented.
Nice.
And now
that's always a good feeling.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, I'm really glad that it actually has, a meaningful impact. And I'm still in touch with all the writers that I work with anyways, because it's like, they're still talented people.
Yeah.
So why not? And so like, it's something that I would definitely like to see a second, year of this year, as soon as my plate clears, because, and one of the things that I am interested in, I'm definitely interested in working with, the authors and the agents that had volunteered the first round. I'm also interested in, getting specifically Black editors and get them paid to do the edits.
Yeah.
Because I'm like, I might as well like, step back and get the money to people, that people that are looking for a leg up on the editorial side as well.
Right.
So, so that will be in the planning stages, hopefully in the coming months. But one of the things I definitely thought about was that I need to give writers more lead time to submit. Because I know like when I did it the first round, I thought like, oh, I should probably do it for like a set amount of time so people would, 1, like be able to submit, and 2, the funding wouldn't be just sitting there.
Sure.
So but I have also understand that at the same time, the summer was really hectic
Mhm.
with the virus and also just general burnout, over, over that, but also just like general creative exhaustion from a lot of Black creatives, which I took very seriously. They're like, I would love to submit, but I'm just stressed out about work and family, or like I'm just stressed out about this country,
Right.
or like my, and there's just so much that I'm worried about that needs to be addressed that I don't think I could submit something, and that's fine. Like,
Right.
I didn't want it to feel like this single opportunity and then the door closes and then it never happens again.
Right, right. Yeah. It's so neat that authors sponsored this.
Mhm.
It's one of my favorite things about the writing community in general is how many authors sort of pay it forward, that they get these opportunities, but then they turn around and give back to sort of the people who are a step or two steps behind them on that path to publication. So that's really encouraging, and I think inspiring to hear that you had that experience of, it sounds like this was sort of something that came about from authors.
Mhm.
So it's really cool. It's really neat.
Yeah, and I'm just really grateful for, the opportunity to do something like that.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. And I think it's really nice that you've been able to keep in touch with everybody, and such a good opportunity for those authors. Did you end up getting a lot of submissions?
Yeah, so like
Mhm.
the window was only 2 weeks.
Mhm.
Um, so but we got like 39 submissions, which
Mhm.
was a lot, I thought. Considering the short amount of time that we had between like
Right.
announcing it and like having the submissions period be open.
Mhm.
So that's why I imagine, you know, if should we do like a second round if we had the submissions period open for longer,
Yeah.
what that turnout would be. So
Yeah. It sounds like it was something that you just kind of like came up with and were like, hey, let's do it. But you're going to have to be a little more organized to do it, to be able to kind of pull it together and do it again. I feel that. I feel that on a
Mhm.
very deep level.
Right.
Yeah, I think it was a really great project, and I do hope you're able to continue it. Um, so I was wondering, sort of, what do you see happening? We've talked about kind of where publishing has come, and especially in the course of the last year and a half, it does seem like it's been a lot of publishing being pushed into a corner in a lot of different ways. I wonder, though, what you think about what might happen sort of in the near future, the next 5-10 years of publishing, and how authors might start kind of preparing for it.
Right. Well, that's a very speculative question.
It is. And it's totally, I just want to give the disclaimer, this is totally opinion. You cannot hold Diana to this.
Right. One of the things I definitely see is, just the continued, you know, diversification towards publication. Like, what
Mhm.
does that mean for authors? I do think, the level of production quality for books, is much, much different, now if you self-publish, even versus 5 years ago.
Mhm.
And I've definitely seen like books that are self-published nowadays that like feel indistinguishable,
Yep.
from something from a traditional house.
Yeah.
Um, so I do think that like because of options like that, writers have more opportunities to produce their own books or to create different types of of publishing companies.
Mhm.
um I've definitely interacted with quite a few publishing collectives in my time, just from like because we're all like going to the same conventions and stuff like that, and I just
Right.
think having a company owned by, the people who work there is very empowering.
Mhm.
Um, I would definitely be, and then you see like a version of that, like in indie publishing, where
Mhm.
you have like a popular indie publisher, and then they basically like create the shared universe and they hire a bunch of writers, but they still own the IP themselves. I
Mhm.
see stuff like that popping up, and I could see that happening more and more in the coming years.
Mhm.
I also, you know, s- conversely, like I also see, I don't think New York publishing is going to be the same. There was already talks, I know anecdotally from colleagues elsewhere about like when will the office reopen, and would you give your employees the option of like working out of state? And that is a game changer, because that instantly changes like the type of people you can employ. It breaks down barriers to access. It makes, the industry is just so much more reasonable for someone to work in. I hope those policies, like if they do get implemented, stay. So I think seeing that shift will be very interesting. I would love to see publishing decentralize. I would love to speculate about where, the next big hub of publishing will live if it's not New York City.
Like Iowa. It's going to be like Iowa, just like right in the middle of the country.
I mean, I imagine that there'll still be like, there'll still be pockets of it. Like, I think, I mean, if we're going to like make bets that people don't hold me to 5 years from now, I think one of the publishing hubs will be in the South. My guts, well, I don't know about like gut feelings, but like I have a strong feeling about Atlanta, for example, because they have such a great creative community in general. And a lot of artists from different fields are already down there. So I wouldn't be surprised if publishing had moved somewhere like that. I won't be surprised if publishing, if you're thinking about like a West Coast venue, like went to Seattle, or Portland. I'm actually not surprised. I wouldn't be surprised at all, but Portland for a lot of reasons. But but just I want publishing to go to different places, and to and I definitely want, and hopefully, if we see that decentralization, we'll also see the rise of the value of the regional author, in a different way. So even if you don't necessarily think about hitting the New York Times list, you can still think about, being like a regional bestseller and making a living off of that. And a lot of, and there are quite a few writers like who do have that status, but people don't really talk about that because it's not that big, flashy, old school vision of what a published author would be like. So,
Yeah, that's an interesting thought. I hadn't thought about where publishing might move to if it left New York. Atlanta would definitely be a really good choice, I think. My money's on Atlanta too. We'll hope for Atlanta anyway.
Right.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'm writing it all down. So 5 years from now, I'm coming back. I'm just kidding. I was wondering, from your perspective with your history at Tor and now at SerialBox, what is your best advice for authors who are seeking publication right now?
Don't despair. I know it can feel like really frustrating and hopeless or opaque and confusing about what publishing is like right now. A lot of people feeling that, not just you writers. I do think that like this is a time of a lot of innovation. This is also a time that feels particularly precarious, to writers, because there used to be a way, like a single way, and at least you can count on that, as a standard way. But now there's so many options, it could feel overwhelming. So I'll tell authors that first thing. Second, I will say like to really depend on your writing community to support you. And this is actually, that's what I say actually at like every convention. When people ask for writing advice on a panel, I say that during the course of a writer's career, you will work with many different editors. You'll probably, 2 or 3 agents to guide you through your career. You'll work at many different publishing houses, but you'll always have like your writer community. And I think especially, it is very important for writers to trust each other, to create, spaces where they can talk about their business stuff, where they can find support for their questions, where they can like find like both like creative emotional support as well as like the material financial questions or the business related questions, because it's like your fellow writers, as well as like your family, your friends, your neighbors, whoever like knows that you're a writer and likes reading books. Those are the people that are going to stick by you and support your career in the end.
Yeah, and there's something really, oh, sorry. I was just going to say, I think there's something really special about having people who are sort of at the same place you are. Because like your friends and family, at least most of the writers I know, like your friends and family can support you, but they don't really get it. So it's nice to have somebody that you can go to and either be excited with or kind of, vent to, who's going to kind of understand what you're talking about.
Right, exactly. And in turn, like I always tell writers too, that just focus on your own work. I know professional jealousy is a thing. Even I get professionally jealous, from like other editors, about like, oh, I wish I could have gotten that book, but you got that book. But it's always like, oh, there it goes.
Yep.
But but I also know that like writers worry about whether like their book will sell compared to like other people in their critique group or like other people in their like MFA cohort, or like they're, like, are they getting an agent fast enough? Like they're shopping at their manuscript. Why aren't people replying back? So, and ultimately like the publishing industry is an industry where, it's powered by passion, but also it's really hard, to think about how much lack of control an author actually has with their work. The only thing they can control is writing it. And then every other step of the process, could be, different factors that impact your story. Right. So the time where the story is completely, I guess like under your control, is probably the strongest amount of power you'll have over it.
Right.
And so that being said, like, don't get professionally jealous. There's so many other factors that impact a person's life. Sometimes, it's a little bit of luck. Sometimes it's timing. And you can't control that for yourself, necessarily. And you shouldn't feel bad about it. And and also I guess like another thing I'll tell writers too is that writing is such a slow process, and it's okay to be slow.
Yeah.
Especially now, I got, creative, like just, brain deadness. I couldn't, read like a book outside of work for most of last year because I just couldn't focus.
Yep.
I know anecdotally a lot of writers saying they couldn't write anything in the past, 12 months, and it's perfectly fine. Writers are worried about falling behind, about missing their deadlines. But I want to say that like everyone in publishing has been feeling the same way, and it's okay to tell someone else, if you're under contract, it's okay to tell your editor, like, I'm having a hard time. It's okay to tell your agent that. It's okay to tell your other writer friends that, even if the ones that you feel on the outside have been like, been so successful, been killing it, it's totally fine. Everyone understands.
Right.
And you should really take care of yourself, and your health, and, and thinking about like how you value your time. Oh.
Yeah, I love all of that. I think generally when we talk about writing and being a writer, so much of it is focused on the actual writing, on the craft and, your process and all of those things. And we definitely leave the mental health aspect out of the conversation way too much. And I think that's really come into focus over this last year. I'm hearing the same things about, people just not really having any creative energy, and just how hard it's been with the pandemic, and, the social culture and the political culture, and just everything that's been happening has been really hard on a lot of people from a creative standpoint. So that's really fantastic advice. I'm wondering, what is the best advice that you've ever received that has really helped you, either personally or professionally, that you'd like to share with writers?
For me, which I think is also relevant to writers, is make sure you have a hobby that isn't your job.
Right.
And that's really, it's really hard to tell. That's something I've actually struggled with. So every few years I try to pick up a new hobby that's like not publishing related or reading related or sci-fi fantasy related.
Right.
Because it's very easy for your job to take over your life. And I think that could happen with writers too. And also just like writers with the additional benefit that whatever else you do in your life, it's going to eventually show up in your writing. So, so the more varied, your everyday life is, I think the stronger it's going to feed your creative mind.
Right. Yeah, that is really good advice. And I'm terrible at that. I've recently started trying to read again, but I still can't really read like a paper book or an ebook. So I'm getting into audiobooks again. I haven't been into audiobooks for years, but I've found that I'm able to read again through audiobooks, which has been really nice. But yeah, when people talk about hobbies, I just slowly fade into the wall, because I'm like, what is a hobby? So yeah, I definitely think that, and especially because I think when you turn your passion into your profession, then I wouldn't say you lose something in it, but then it becomes something more. It's not just this thing you're doing for pure pleasure anymore. And so you do need something that you're doing just for you, not for money or business or acclaim, but just something that you're doing for yourself. I totally agree with that. We have a few minutes left, and I've been very excited to see if I was going to have time to ask you. I saw when I was just looking at your website and finding out more about you, I saw that you have a love of steampunk, and that you've been interviewed several times about fandoms and intersectionality when it comes to fandoms. And I'd love if you can just talk about that until it's time for us to stop.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, where to start, really?
Well, so what's your favorite sort of fandom, or where are you at with that?
So right now, in terms of fandoms, steampunk has been a huge part of my life for most of my adulthood. It was something I first got into when I graduated from undergrad. It was actually the reason why I got my master's in performance studies. It was the focus of my study was a performance of racial and national identity in steampunk subculture.
Nice.
I got in several academic publications from that specifically. It's something that I am continually fascinated by, because I think just the interplay between history and speculative fiction, the what if scenario, but also having the emphasis on design and aesthetics in a way that feels like lived experience, really fascinates me. I was also a 19th century English Russian literature major in undergrad. So that's on top of that, that's why the long 19th century has been a fascination for me personally.
Sure.
But that I think was something that truly pulled me into science fiction editorial in a weird way. Because I started off as steampunk blogger. I ran a blog called Beyond Victoriana about multicultural steampunk for several years.
Mm-hmm.
And then I was asked by Liz Garinsky, who was an editor at Tor at the time, whether I'd be a blogger for their new website, Tor.com.
Mm-hmm.
And so I kind of like credit steampunk for like linking me into like the rest of my geeky life.
That's so cool. It's so neat how things come together like that.
So yeah, it really is. You know, other than that, like other fandoms, you know, that I'm super into, I am, you know, I fell behind, but I definitely like watched a ton of anime and read a lot of manga
Mm-hmm.
growing up. And I still have like, you know, things that I want to like keep tabs on, things that I'll always love. Full Metal Alchemist.
Mm-hmm.
Always love, I'll always have a, you know, soft spot for that. You know, uh other things that, you know, I've just like enjoyed. Avatar The Last Airbender, and now the big news about Avatar Studios.
Yep.
I'm super excited about that.
Yes, yes.
You know, I think it's like one of the most interesting franchises to follow, just
Mm-hmm.
because the the canon for like all the other like, you know, ancillary materials, you know, the comic books especially, I
Mm-hmm.
am super impressed with how much they were able to expand upon the original television show series,
Mm-hmm.
uh, but also be able to formulate them in a way that grows with the target audience. So like if you were like 9 to 11 and you watched Avatar: The Last Airbender and then you read the comics were like the perfect transition to YA and adult fiction because they were able to, you know, follow the characters as they got older.
Nice.
You know, so I thought that like, you know, I thought it just dovetailed super, super well. And very few franchises are able to do it like that in the same way. So I'm really excited to see what happens, you know, with this the Avatar Studios once it gets off the ground. Um, no, and you know, and otherwise, like, you know, what's really been a silver lining with the pandemic, that when my reader brain went out of commission, there was still a ton of, you know, TV shows and fantasy shows that I just like, you know, watched in mainline. Like I didn't get into like Star Trek Discovery until the pandemic. I knew it
Mm-hmm.
was happening. I knew, you know, and I was, you know, I grew up watching Next Gen and all that stuff.
Right.
And I'm like, oh yeah, like I should check it out. And then eventually, like, all right, I guess we'll get CPS access. When they had the deal, like Picard was available,
Mm-hmm.
you know, for free for people. I'm like, all right, gonna do it. And then we stayed on. We watched like all of Discovery. We watched, you know, all the Lower Decks.
Yes, yes. I was just
Yeah.
going to ask you about that.
Yeah, and it's weird too because it's like I wasn't a super like huge into Star Trek as a
Yeah,
kid, even though I watched all the time.
sure.
But now I feel like the latest series they've done a really smart way of dovetailing a lot of like, you know, references and throwbacks, but able to expand upon the tone of the show
Yes.
in different directions.
Yeah, I was really
So
surprised with Picard and how different that show was tonally from anything that they've done with that character before.
right.
So yeah, I think it's again, I agree with you. I think it's been a really interesting transition to see how they take this source material and create more modern storytelling and character development with it. And I'm the
Mhm.
same way. I grew up watching Star Trek. My parents were like original Star Trek fans and so had followed it all the way through.
Mhm.
But I think it's sort of, I was never really a fan of it myself, but yeah, all of the new stuff, although I think Lower Decks might be my favorite, like
Mhm.
addition to the whole universe. But yeah, so what do you think it is about fandoms that draws people in the way it does?
You know, I think naturally, if you have really compelling, you know, storytelling, you're gonna get a fandom.
Mm-hmm.
That's it. Like it, you know, and some people are like, "Are you sure this is it?" You know, because there's so many different types of fandoms, and there's so many different categories of fandom.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like, of course, there's like sports fandoms,
Sure.
and there's like celebrity culture, you
Mm-hmm.
know, fandoms, and there's music fandoms, and people like get really intensely obsessed about what they love in different ways.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but essentially what creates a fandom isn't just something that is a pretty visual, or something that like it's flashy or whatever. It's the story that's told behind, the media or the TV show or the football game
Right.
or the pro wrestling match. Like, it's the storytelling that gets people invested. Even, music fandom has its own type of stories.
Sure.
In following these, celebrities.
Sure.
And it's basically, that is the core of fandom, I personally think. And I'm totally not biased working in publishing.
I know. The human brain really is geared towards story. I mean, you know this, the human brain really is geared towards story. And I think that like boy bands were doing brand storytelling way before it was cool. And I mean, so I can totally see that there. I think I can totally understand. Of course, I'm biased as well. So, we'd have to ask somebody maybe who's not a story brain person. So, so yeah, that was so much fun. I'm so glad I got to ask you.
Yeah, of course.
So before we wrap up, do you have any final thoughts, anything you'd like to share with the WriteHive community that we haven't covered?
I think that covers like the core of everything I wanted to share with y'all. And of course, people who are interested in learning more about what SerialBox does, if you're interested in being a writer and working with us, as we say, like on Twitter, my DMs are open.
Right. So can you tell us what your Twitter handle is so people can follow you?
Yeah, so it is writer syndrome. One word, spelled like it is. You can also find me at dianamfo.com, where all of my social media platforms are linked, or and I have an open contact form, and people can reach out there as well.
Great. So, and you'll also be able to ask questions through WriteHive, and those questions will make it to Diana as well. So, Diana, I just want to thank you again for joining me for this and for being a part of the WriteHive convention, and for everything you do for the writing community and helping bring new stories out into the world. It's really been a pleasure getting to talk to you.
Yeah, it's been an absolute joy to talk to you too. And thank you again so much for having me here.
Yes, it was definitely my pleasure.